Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. Today we're going to begin a new series on the book of Daniel, and so I'm going to read just the first two verses of Daniel. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Well, just over a month ago, we concluded our series on what makes a church a good church, and I was thinking about what to might do next, and I was kind of drawn to the book of Daniel. And the more that I looked at it, the more I felt it was a book that really speaks into our time, and one that actually addresses a lot of key issues that is facing the church today. So between now and the summer break, we'll work our way through the first 6 chapters. Most biblical scholars and preachers divide the book of Daniel into 2 equal halves between chapters 6 and 7, not just because it's a neat mathematical division, but because of the very different content of the 2 halves. The first 6 chapters contain some of the most exciting and dramatic stories found in the Bible. They are thrilling stories of faith and the power of God that delight and encourage those who desire to live faithfully for God in this pagan environment. The final 6 chapters couldn't be more different. They're a radical shift from the dramatic personal stories of the characters in the earlier chapters. They're mostly apocalyptic visions that have seasoned Bible scholars scratching their heads wondering what it all means. And to be fair, Daniel himself was very troubled by them, and despite his proven wisdom and discernment, he struggled to understand them. So the 2 halves are at first glance very different. However, they are united by a common theme that flows through the whole book, namely that in spite of present appearances, God is in control. In fact, that is the central point of the book and its overarching and unifying theme. It's a point that Daniel makes repeatedly in a variety of ways, and one that will come up in almost every passage that we consider over the coming weeks. Excuse me. Whilst Daniel has several exciting and thrilling stories, it also has its share of complicated textual and theological issues, with plenty for scholars to puzzle over and to disagree about. And I'm going to leave those puzzles to the scholars. Today, I just want to provide an introduction and some of the background to Daniel, exploring what was going on in Judah and the wider world that led to Daniel and his friends being taken as captives to Babylon. And in doing that, to kind of try and signpost some of the key points we'll consider in greater depth in the coming weeks. Now, depending on who you ask, the book of Daniel was either written in the 6th or the 2nd century BC, or possibly even both. Whilst it mostly focuses on the individual experiences of Daniel and his friends, it's part of the larger story of the world events that were playing out at the time. And it's also part of the larger story of the Bible. Many of the themes that are found elsewhere in the Bible are also found in Daniel. And there are numerous quotations from Daniel in the letter of Revelation. And of course, it famously refers to one like a son of man or a son of the gods, traditionally understood as a vision of Jesus. So Daniel is very much part of the biblical story of redemption. The first and last sentences of the opening chapter set the events of the book in a specific time and place, from the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and the 1st year of the reign of Cyrus, the king of Persia. So roughly from about 605 BC to about 537 BC. When we read Daniel then, we're not just reading a religious text, we're reading history. It's a story about real people who lived in a real place in real time. Incidentally, there are sources from outside the Bible that confirm some of what Daniel writes about. For example, this is a Babylonian chronicle, a cuneiform cylinder that refers to Nebuchadnezzar's capture of Jerusalem in 597 BC. No historian, of course, is completely objective. They always bring something of themselves to the story that they're telling, and Daniel is no different. The book recounts historical events, but viewed through Daniel's eyes. And Daniel interprets the events of his captivity and life in Babylon through the lens of what he knows and understands about God, who God is, what he is like, and what he does, how he acts. And we should note that his account is concerned with why things happened rather than just the facts of what happened. And so, although it's interpreted history, it is nonetheless history. And so, as John Lennox notes, the first thing Daniel tells us about God is that he is involved in human history. And that truth is a challenge to the beliefs and values of our postmodern secular society. In his book, A Secular Age, Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor writes that in 1500 it was virtually impossible not to believe in God in a Western society. But by 2000, many in Western societies find disbelief not only easy, but inescapable. It is the default position of most people in our society. When the idea that God does not exist is the dominant cultural position, well, the idea that there is a God who is involved, actively involved in human history is even more preposterous. And people like Daniel are written off as primitive and unenlightened. At best, it is assumed in our secular age that if God's existence is affirmed, even theoretically, well, he must be distant and beyond us. If there's a God who created everything, well, he created it and then he went off and left us to our own devices. Yet, Daniel is signposting something that is made explicit in John's Gospel and that billions of people still affirm today. John tells us in his Gospel that the Word who was God took on human flesh and lived among us. Far from being distant or uncaring, God's response to the tragedy, suffering and sorrow of human existence was to fully enter it, to experience that tragedy, suffering and sorrow firsthand in order that he might redeem it. God's involvement in human history is an incredibly important truth, and one that we may need reminding of in these days. That just as God was at work in the personal and the international events of Daniel's time, so too he is at work in ours. A second thing that Daniel tells us about God is that human history is not without meaning. Being taken captive to a foreign pagan country where he would spend the rest of his life must have been very difficult for Daniel and his friends. But they understood that the hand of God was behind it all. And the story begins with two major events. Firstly, Nebuchadnezzar's rise to power following the death of his father, Nabopolassar. And secondly, Judah's spiritual descent into covenant unfaithfulness and idolatry that culminated in exile. In between those two events, there was a lot of geopolitical turmoil and no small amount of personal tragedy. But there was also courageous faith and the mighty hand of God at work. In 612 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's father had captured Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, effectively ending their position as the dominant world power, which of course Nebuchadnezzar's father wanted for himself. And so then he challenged Egypt, the other great world power at the time, and he sent his son Nebuchadnezzar to fight them, and he defeated Pharaoh's army at Carchemish in 605 BC, the year that his father died, and so he ascended to the throne. So in 605, Assyria was destroyed and Egypt was diminished, but not completely removed as a threat to Babylon. Egypt remained a thorn in Nebuchadnezzar's side. And Judah, well, Judah was piggy in the middle between both Babylon and Egypt's dreams of empire. 2 Kings 23 in verse 34 tells us that Necho, the Pharaoh of Egypt, appointed Jehoiakim as king of Judah, as this kind of Egypt's puppet ruler, if you like. And so Nebuchadnezzar had good reasons to seek to harass, to subdue, or try and replace Jehoiakim. And he invaded Judah 3 times. Firstly in 605 BC, and it's likely that Daniel and his friends were taken to Babylon in that first invasion. He invaded again in 597 BC when Jehoiakim surrendered Jerusalem and went into captivity with many of the Jewish elite, including army commanders and priests like Ezekiel. When King Jehoiakim had died, Nebuchadnezzar had placed Zedekiah on the throne, another puppet ruler. But he later rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and so in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah a final time, this time completely destroying Jerusalem and deporting large numbers of people, including the prophet Jeremiah. That all sounds like normal international politics in the ancient world, how things were, except it's not. For all of this happened not because of political intrigue and the empire desires of Nebuchadnezzar or anyone else. This all happened by the mighty hand of God. For example, reading Jeremiah, it's very clear that Nebuchadnezzar was God's instrument of judgment against his people for their idolatry and rebellion against him. For a long time before Nebuchadnezzar set his sights on Jerusalem, the people had been repeatedly disloyal to God and to the requirements of the covenant, engaging in immoral behaviour, acting unjustly and oppressively, and of course participating in idolatry. And so God sent prophet after prophet to warn them of the consequences of their disobedience, consequences that were spelled out in the covenant that they had agreed to. But they would not listen. They rejected largely the message of the prophets. I mean, Jeremiah himself, he'd warned them for 40 years about the coming judgment of God. And all he got for it was to be mocked and abused, imprisoned in the city, and threatened with death. I mean, he's called the weeping prophet for a reason. But, I mean, people just mocked him because, I mean, after 40 years of preaching about a coming judgment, an army from the north, and nothing had happened, people just didn't believe him. Until one day, the judgment that he'd warned about finally arrived in the form of the Babylonian army. As Lennox puts it, the punishment fit the crime. The nation had compromised with immorality, injustice, and idolatry, and so it would be taken into captivity by the most idolatrous nation on earth. A nation that also practiced immorality and injustice. Babylon's rise to be the dominant empire of the age wasn't fate. It wasn't the skillful plans of Nebuchadnezzar's army. Rather, it was God directing the events of Babylon's rise to be his instrument of judgment against his people. Each invasion was an act of judgment by God against his rebellious people and an opportunity for them to repent and return to covenant faithfulness, an opportunity that they repeatedly scorned. And so each time the invasion was more severe in its effect. And of course God would raise another king, Cyrus, to enact his judgment against Babylon for its sins and to return his people from their exile. In Isaiah 45 verse 1, God describes Cyrus, who conquered Babylon, as his anointed. And he says, I took his right hand in order to subdue nations. In fact, in chapter 2 verse 21, Daniel says that God deposes kings and raises up others. In other words, God was behind the world events of his day, even the events that led Daniel and his friends to be in captivity in a pagan land. One of the things that the final 7 chapters of Daniel tells us is that history is moving towards a conclusion. And that conclusion implies meaning and purpose. The conclusion of history is spelled out for us clearly in the final chapters of Revelation, where John writes, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.' He who was seated on the throne said, 'I am making everything new.' And then he said, 'Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.'" The Apostle Paul tells us in Romans that God is working all things together, even our tragedies, even wars, even economic and political crises. He is working all things towards that goal. As one scholar puts it, the fortunes of kings and the affairs of men are subject to God's decrees. He is able to accomplish his will despite the most determined opposition of the mightiest potentates on earth. In the 6th century, Nebuchadnezzar, as king of a vast empire, thought that he was the one who was directing world events, as had every king who came before him or after him. In the 21st century, every would-be emperor thinks the same. Whether it is Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, doesn't matter. Their empires will collapse or fade away like all the others before him. History teaches us that kings, tyrants and empires come and go, but it's not random. It's the hand of God. When I was on the Camino in Spain, I walked through the great Roman city of Caparra. Except it wasn't a great city. It was just a pile of rocks on the ground. And I thought, so end all empires. Only the kingdom of God endures. We must hold firmly to these truths because our times are as politically and as socially turbulent as the times in which Daniel lived, albeit in a different way, but they cause the same anxiety. It would not be exaggerating to say that we are living through times of global upheaval, unlike anything we've seen since the Second World War. The balance of world power is shifting today as surely as it did in Daniel's time. President Trump has set fire to the rule book of international relations and global trade, upending political alliances and agreed economic policies that have been in place for almost a century. The global impact of that will be felt for decades to come. The wars in Gaza and Ukraine continue to have the potential for escalation with other nations. And the tensions between India and Pakistan could erupt into full-scale war. You don't have to be a news addict to know that we are living in a time of national and international turmoil. And our times are also increasingly secular. Christian faith in the West is increasingly being challenged by both legal and social developments. One could argue that we are returning to the pagan religious world that Daniel knew. And with that being the case, it's important that we understand and affirm that the God who was actively involved in the turbulent events of the 6th century BC is the same God who is actively involved in the turbulent events of the 21st century. And that he is moving all of these events towards the goal that he has set for creation. I know many Christians today who are worried, anxious, even afraid about the political and social challenges that are unfolding nationally and internationally. I can't help but wonder if that fear is the result of having forgotten that God is actively involved in human affairs, in human history, that he entered into it, and that despite all the appearances to the contrary, that God is in control. God is acting in history, but he acts in ways that we don't understand. Ways that make us uncomfortable, ways that disturb our peace and our ease, and perhaps ways that even endanger us in some way. It is striking that in Daniel chapter 3, God did not prevent the three friends from being thrown into the furnace, but he stood with them amidst the flames. As we will see, the very fact that Daniel and his friends were in Babylon was, from a human perspective, a disaster. It entailed suffering and hardship and challenge to their faith in God. Daniel was there for about 70 years, roughly. But their response, Daniel and his friends' response to that, in some ways is a model for us as we seek to live faithfully in the new pagan environment in which we find ourselves. God is working in human history, moving all of history towards its ultimate goal, not necessarily in ways that we would choose. But as Daniel and his friends discovered, he is the God who can be trusted, even when the world around us is in turmoil. And despite all evidence to the contrary, he is the God who is in control. Thanks for listening.